What is the most horrifying piece of information you have to share? For a lot of people, the first sign of cardiovascular disease is sudden death. My husband thought he'd pulled a muscle. It kept getting worse, so, finally in May we went to urgent care. He was having a heart attack, but the tech doing the ECG was confused and went to get the doctor. The ECG machine was showing a heart attack. His blood pressure, though, was on the low end of normal. If they'd just taken his blood pressure, they'd have said he was fine, and sent him home. Thankfully, when he said his chest hurt, he got jumped to the front, and then when the doctor confirmed that the tech was reading it right, they put him in an ambulance over to the university hospital where the cardiac team is. Looking back, there were probably a couple of smaller ones over the past 2 years. They put in a stent, and he's doing well now, but if you're having what feels like muscle pain in your chest but haven't done anything that would cause it, please consider getting it checked. My husband is at a healthy weight, walks everywhere, has great blood pressure, but he still had a heart attack. Sometimes, when an elderly person falls, and ends up with a broken hip, it's actually the hip breaking that causes the fall. That's why you do your squats, and get your daily intake of calcium and vitamin D. Another related fact, if you are over 65 and break a hog or a femur, there is a good chance you are not leaving the hospital alive. Carbon dioxide was blamed for the deaths of around 1,700 people in Cameroon, West Africa, in 1986, when a massive release of gas occurred from Lake Nyos, a volcanic crater lake. The clinical findings in 845 survivors seen at, or admitted to hospital, were compatible with exposure to an asphyxiant gas. They were just sleeping, when the lake released a giant cloud of CO2, and wiped out almost an entire village. I work in the fire protection industry. We use a lot of different chemicals to extinguish fires in server rooms, high-voltage switchboards, etc. Honestly, CO2 exposure would not be a great way to go, but you would most likely be so disoriented that you wouldn't know what was happening to you. During the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster, the flight data shows that the astronauts turned on their internal oxygen supplies after the explosion, so it's likely that some of them were still alive when they hit the water. Big Bird was also supposed to be on that shuttle, until they realized it would be a logistical nightmare to fit him in there, so, somewhere in the infinite universes, Big Bird effing died on national television, in front of millions of children. The American blood supply runs on about a 2 to 3 day buffer for most products. If for some reason, the entire system shut down for a couple of weeks, people would die for lack of transfusions. And while at least 60% of our citizens are eligible to donate blood, only 5% of those people ever will. If that number went to around 8%, no blood bank would ever need to call you again. Scarier than this. If you are O negative, and you donate once, you will never stop receiving calls to donate, as long as you live. My husband is O negative, universal blood donor, and I'm AB+, universal plasma donor. We joke that we've got everyone we love covered, in case of emergency, but the pandemic made us realize that there might actually be a situation in which that would be needed. We'd both donated at that point, and were each getting a lot of calls. When Judith Barcy, the voice of Ducky, in The Land Before Time, was murdered by her father, she was halfway through doing voice work for All Dogs Go to Heaven. Her last recorded voice lines is her goodbye to Charlie, played by Burt Reynolds. Reynolds recorded his lines after her death. It took him 63 takes to get through it, and you can tell he's barely keeping it together when doing the scene. There are orphanages full of kids who will never be adopted, and many might not live long enough to graduate from the facility. The reason is that these are kids rescued from, or abandoned, by the child sex trade. They have an eclectic selection of STDs. HIV is rife. And most have major emotional and psychological issues from the abuse they suffered. In what countries are these orphanages located? The one I saw depicted was in Cambodia. But if I remember correctly, the narration said similar places were in Laos and Thailand. I did some work in Cambodia with these groups. The amount of girls under 12 who were in the sex trader is effing disturbing. What's worse, the Western men who go there to do it. On February 3, 1998, 20 people died when a cable car, situated near the ski resort town of Cavallese, Italy, plummeted to the ground from 260 feet. It was caused when a United States Marine Corps EA-6B Prowler aircraft, which was flying excessively fast and too low during a low-altitude training mission, ultimately severed the cable that supported the cable car, as it was descending from Mount Cermus. The disaster has been named, the Strage del Cermus, Massacre of Cermus, in Italy. The pilot, Captain Richard J. Ashby, and his navigator, Captain Joseph Schweitzer, were ultimately deemed not guilty of involuntary manslaughter and negligent homicide, for their roles in the disaster. However, they were found guilty of obstruction of justice and conduct, unbecoming an officer and a gentleman, upon being found to have destroyed camcorder footage, recorded from the plane's cockpit. During time working at Pearl Harbor National Memorial, I came across two horrifying tidbits. When the USS Oklahoma rolled over, it trapped sailors inside with no way of rescuing them. Cutting through the hull was impossible, a single gap would have caused the air pocket to collapse, and flood the compartment. The workers still heard banging on hull during Christmas, nearly 3 weeks after the attack, and plugged their ears with cotton, to drown it out. The second tidbit is, that by the time the workers got the ship upright and drained, workers were only collecting bits and pieces of remains. When caskets of the unknown sailors were exhumed, to begin DNA identification, they discovered over 100 different strands of DNA, from a single coffin. L'Angolo di Gigi, the iconic Italian restaurant, run by chef Gigi Ferruzzo, left an indelible mark on the culinary scene in the capital of Colombia in the 80s, not only for its exquisite flavors, but also for the dark rumors that surrounded it. It was said that the gourmet dishes served there, located on the road to La Calera, were prepared with human flesh. Little is known about Ferruzzo, because it's known that he was a butcher from a young age, and emigrated from Italy to settle in Colombia. Over time, he began associating with influential politicians in the country, and his behavior changed so much, that many compared him to a mobster. Rumors spread that these politicians were not only his friends, but also the ones supplying the bodies he allegedly used in his cooking, because a supposed former member of the secret police claimed that the bodies from the wars against guerrillas and drug trafficking were sold to Ferruzzo, and that, on the day of the Palace of Justice siege, he was allowed to select the plumpest corpses. To this day, the whereabouts of these people are unknown, and that is why, one of the theories is that he cooked them and fed them to his diners. The situation worsened when restaurant employees began to suspect something was wrong, as Ferruzzo wouldn't allow anyone else to handle the meat, because he claimed it was imported from Italy, sent by his sister, although she later denied this. Eventually, after these rumors circulated, L'Angolo di Gigi closed its doors, and Ferruzzo disappeared, over 40 years ago, leaving his fate shrouded in mystery. No one knows what happened to him. That doctors admitted to euthanizing patients at Memorial Medical Center Hospital in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina, because their only other option was to leave them to die. Several were charged, but have defended their decisions as the only humane choice in an impossible situation. One patient in particular was not terminal, but due to his size, was unable to be moved. I knew her, lost touch, when I moved away after Katrina. I don't believe it was done out of malice, it really was a horrible situation that they were faced with. I was there during Katrina. It was a very unnerving feeling, to know that you were literally trapped, with no power, water, or food. I've never heard quiet like I did, trying to sleep on the second floor of a building, with 4 feet of water in the first floor. Prions, aka a misfolded protein in the brain, that causes other proteins to misfold. This literally causes sponge brain, or large holes in the brain. It is always fatal, and there is no known cure, or treatment, to slow the progression. Prion disease can be contagious or genetic. The contagious form cannot be killed by extreme heat, meaning that people with prion disease, who have to have surgery, those instruments used during surgery cannot be sterilized. The most prevalent contagious form of prion disease is bovine spongiform encephalopathy, aka mad cow disease. Chronic wasting disease, CWD, is another common form of prion disease, which affects mostly deer. While there are no human cases of CWD, it is theorized that the disease could be capable of infecting humans. Prion disease can also be sporadic, meaning the cause is not genetic or contagious, ultimately unknown. The most common form of prion disease, CJD, is mostly sporadic. Prion disease can lay dormant in the body for years. But once it is activated, the average prognosis is about 1 year. DR, prions make holes in your brain that you will ultimately die from. It can be contagious, genetic, or idiopathic. Once the disease is active, you have, at most, a couple years to live. There is no cure, or treatment, to slow the disease at this time. One wonderful prion disease is fatal insomnia, fatal familial insomnia if it's the hereditary variety. Both exist. You start struggling to fall asleep at night, maybe you wake up a little more tired than usual. You decide to cut down on caffeine, go outside more, and eventually, you'll reach for the sleeping pills, but nothing quite seems to work. The doctors draw blood, but your numbers come back fine. Your sleep quality decreases even further, and you're prescribed the heavy stuff, diazepam or something, just to shut your brain off for a few more minutes each night. Just like everything else you've tried, it doesn't work. You start getting panic attacks, and become paranoid of everyone around you. Exhausted and anxious, you'll get a sleep study done. This reveals that your brain barely enters REM sleep, the type of deep sleep you need in order to keep you alive. By this point, you're a shell of your former self, barely conscious, but somehow, still awake. By the time they figure out what's wrong with you, it's palliative care until the end. They can knock you out to give you the illusion of a day and night cycle, but they cannot make you sleep. The prions are eating away at your brain as you slip further into delusion. You start hallucinating, you cannot string together sentences anymore. And eventually, you just die. You can't function, on that little sleep, for more than a few months. The average time between diagnosis and death is an agonizing year and a half. That's 18 months of knowing you're going to get worse and die. That you'll never have a good night's sleep again in your entire life. And then at the end, you're not even a shell of yourself, you're just an empty body on a ventilator. Good night. I lost my leg to a bug bite that I had no knowledge of getting. One day, my ankle swelled up, and I thought it was just me getting old. It got progressively worse. This was during COVID, so I didn't have a lot of options. After being up for a few days from pain and running a fever, I went to the emergency room, and was diagnosed as having a sprained ankle. They gave me pain medication which helped me sleep. I woke up after 18 hours, to blisters under my ace bandage. I don't have any memory of anything, until I woke up after my third surgery of them, removing more and more of my leg. It was necrotizing fasciitis. I lost everything from a medical misdiagnosis. I am currently just about starving to death, as disability doesn't pay enough, even though I worked my whole life, and did everything I was supposed to. Gaze detection. The human brain seems to be able to sense if someone is staring at us, even if we do not see the person at all. This ability has probably protected us from predators. So, if you have sometimes felt that someone was staring at you, chances are, someone really was. The Byford Dolphin Accident. November 5, 1983. 4 saturation divers were in a decompression chamber, which was pressurized to 9 atmospheres, when one of the tenders outside released the docking collar of the diving bell, before the diver inside had closed the hatch all the way, resulting in an explosive decompression of the chamber, killing all 4 of the divers, and the tender who caused it. The diver who was near the hatch was sucked out of the chamber, from a small gap, along with all the air rushing out. Due to lack of better words, he was literally turned into pulp, and his remains were sprayed all over the deck outside. People find this one rightfully horrifying, but for the guys involved, they probably didn't even have time to register anything. My contender for horrible diving accident is the Paria disaster, where a group of divers were violently sucked into an underwater oil pipe, until they came to rest in an air pocket deep in the pipe. One of the divers managed to crawl his way back out, including through a submerged section, where he could not have known that there was air on the other side. The others remained stuck in the pipe until their passing. So, that's my nightmare, in case you were wondering. In early May of 1898, a 10-year-old boy, named Joseph Bufonchio, was playing at the corner of 3rd and Jackson, in what was known as the Great Jackson Street Chuck Hole. It was 8 feet deep, and 16 feet wide. The local children loved to play in these large pools of muck. These children would build rafts, and push themselves across these miniature lakes by using poles to push them along. In doing so, at 4:30 p.m. Joseph's pole got stuck at the bottom of the chuck hole, and he fell in, and sank to the bottom. This event was such a huge spectacle, that up to 2,000 voyeurs watched at what was described as a comical event, as men clumsily struggled to retrieve the boy's body. One by one, they fell into the muddy mess, as the crowd cheered and laughed. It wasn't until Joseph's father arrived, and yelled out to the crowd, "It is my poor boy that has been drowned. Have you no regard for my grief?" Just then, silence fell over the great chuck hole. It wasn't until 6 p.m. that they recovered his body, and he was rushed to a local bathhouse, where Dr. Rogers, who theorized was that a body could be revived, even after it had been in the water for several hours. He worked on the boy's body until 9 p.m., with no success. Embarrassed by the incident, the city of Seattle made rules to prevent anyone else from drowning, by placing life preservers at all intersections, and demanding that all children learn to swim. I love how that was the solution, not fixing or covering the sinkholes. Also, did people used to lack empathy to a shocking degree? How could anyone think this event was funny? On November 25, 1988, a Japanese high school girl, named Junko Furuta, was threatened and brought to the house of a teenager, who, along with his friends, proceeded to torture and rape the girl countless times, for 44 days straight. In the end, the Furuta was severely malnourished and was left in an incredibly weakened mental and physical state. On January 4, 1988, she was killed after being beaten up, and having her face burned, by the group of boys. Less than 24 hours after her death, her body was wrapped in a blanket, placed in a travel bag, put inside a metal drum, which was filled with wet cement, and dumped in a construction site, in Tokyo. A Quora channel, named 911 Graphic Content, has a lot of really fascinating and macabre articles on it. Two in particular spring to mind. One is a personal account of a witness, and another is a scientific breakdown. There's a membership fee to access the articles, but I found them thoroughly engaging, and well worth at least a month's payment. The witness was someone doing triage before the towers fell, but after some people jumped. They were putting tags on the people and bodies and remains they found, so, if anyone could survive, the doctors would gauge that at a distance via the colored tags. He came across a woman, who had clearly fallen from the building, so at least 50 stories and probably more like 90. Her lower body was destroyed, but her upper torso and head were apparently intact. She yelled at him that she wasn't dead, and to come back. The story is called Black Tag, and you can find it in a few different places, and on a video interviewer with the witness. The implication was that at least one person survived the fall from the towers, enough to speak to someone. The scientific breakdown is about how long it would take an airliner to go from nose tip to tail into the building, and how long it takes for your mind to see, recognize, and understand something happening in front of you. There's a lot of physics mentioned, and at the end of the article is a video where you can test your reaction time. The fastest reaction time image was one I could totally see and understand. The implication is that some people at the very back of Flight 11 and Flight 175 could see the explosion of glass and metal and fire in front of them before they died in the impact. You are not immune to being brainwashed. People don't get sucked into cults because they are stupid. It could happen to you. Also, cults are not always religious, they just often are. Cults draw you in by making you feel smart and appreciated and loved. They douse you in affection and praise, and then they use your trust in them to isolate you from the voices of reason in your life. If someone is being super nice to you for a long time, making you feel special, and then they start telling you that you should cut off multiple people in your life, especially if it's the people telling you that something is wrong, that's a red flag. They will tell you that those people are unsupportive, and that you don't need people like that in your life. This is a systematic way to cut off any resistance, so the only reasoning you will hear is their own. And all the while, they will seem so kind and supportive. Do not get sucked into this trap. Seeing my partner hanging in our garage, and having to cut him down and do CPR. He died 10 days later. That has been the worst. We had an argument, and I went to have a cry in the forest. I came back 15 minutes later to see him in the garage. But his head was at a weird tilt, and he wasn't responding. And then I noticed his feet weren't touching the floor. I shouted his name, and tried to pull the rope off, but it was tight. I ran to the kitchen, and got a knife to cut him down. He was a lot taller than me, and I couldn't brace his weight as he fell. I started CPR, ran to call emergency services, and ran back to continue CPR. The sound that came out of his mouth, my breath. The ambulance came in 7 minutes. They cut open his shirt, an Ajax soccer shirt, and I said he'd be pissed, as it was his favorite shirt. They said I should wait outside. He was alive, but brain dead. I stayed with him for 10 days in the hospital, while he was in a coma, on full life support. He'd have tonic and clonic fits regularly. As I was his partner, they asked if I wanted to turn off life support. I said yes. If he ever would come out of the coma, He'd be severely disabled, and it was a big if. His dad and I were there at 4:11 a.m. on February 21, 2009, when his heart let out. I was holding his hand. I felt him go cold, almost instantly. I miss that man every day of my life. Once you begin to show signs of rabies, it's already too late to do anything about it. You have an inevitable and terrifying death ahead of you. Also, it's possible to get rabies from even a tiny, unnoticeable scratch, possibly while you're sleeping. If you've been camping in the last couple months, you could have it right now, and not even know it. I met a Holocaust survivor when I was in 8th grade. He told me there was a pregnant woman who silently delivered her baby during roll call, standing up, blood and premature child running down her leg. She carefully dug a hole in the snow with her heel, and buried the child. He also talked about how cold his feet were all throughout the winter. Every time I walk outside in the cold with my bare feet, I think about that. Our crew went out to a mall to do some repair work in the main electrical room. The area around one of the main electrical panels was cordoned off with safety tape. The entire top half of the panel was mostly fused. What wasn't fused together was badly burnt and melted. When we had all gotten into the electrical room, our boss closed the door and said, "Full disclosure, that smell is burnt flesh." A maintenance man was working on the panel when a pry bar he had used to get the dead front off fell across the main lugs. Fortunately, he did not survive. You will all be wearing full hazmat gear while working in this room. EMS did try to get as much of him as they could out of the panel, but there may be some residue. The adoption industry, especially infant adoption, is actually human trafficking, and sometimes genocide, dressed up in a social justice trench coat. It's actually a multi-billion-dollar industry that quite literally profits off selling children. Just Google Georgetown or the 60 Scoop. Adoption has a long history of being used as a tool of genocide and colonization, especially for Native communities. It disconnects a person from their culture and community, which was what was done to me. Even foster care is highly questionable. It emerged around the same time that enslavement was ended, and was utilized as a way for farmers to get free labor. Nowadays, states steal money from foster children, and roughly 90% of them will be abused within the system. Most children who are in foster care have some family who want them home. Neglect is often a code word for poverty. My own adoptive parents thought they were saving a baby, but my adoption never should have been legal, and according to the UN, it was an act of genocide. My adoption paperwork was edited because I was worth more money without my heritage. I am white presenting. White infants can be worth up to $60,000. The prices are based on ability and race. Adoptees are overrepresented within all psychiatric settings, like inpatient and outpatient facilities, rehabs, the troubled teen industry, and psychiatric emergency rooms. Which in the US, generates even more money. We are 4 times more likely to attempt suicide than the general public. We are also overrepresented within the prison system, again, generates more money in the US, and among serial killers. Considering how many wars there have been, in just over a century, and the number of unstable and hostile nations in possession of nukes, at the ready, for just one of them to have a particularly bad day, the likelihood of mankind existing more than another 50 years, looks exceedingly grim. That being said, there is way too much time wasted on grudges, arguments, and worrying about your calorie intake. Be kind, and seek common ground and compassion for one another. Have that cheesecake. Stop doom scrolling, and get out and ride motorcycles, go skydiving, or whatever sounds fun to you. Ignore all the hate and judgmental BS everywhere. Yesterday, I was 25 and full of life. Now I'm 55 and full of regret for countless things. With my health, I may not see 60. I'm going to make the most of what I have left.